with that, those pitfalls, right? Some problems with decentralization, right? That it's not a perfect organizing system. No one's discovered a perfect organizing system, either socially or, kind of in terms of, radical community and political organizing. If one of us had figured out the secret, uh, we we wouldn't be where we're at today, I guess is the simple way to say it, right? So some problems of decentralization. It can lead to an overemphasis on localism and self-sufficiency, um, right? And that can lead to a whole bunch of problems, like they can become isolated and xenophobic, even unecological in ways, instead of part of a global movement, right? So we can decentralization can lead to us being in silos, right? Especially if we don't have, like I said, those finely tuned communications and coordination systems. Then even if we wanted to talk and coordinate, it's hard to do. And so we just kind of get reverted back into our bubble. And it's never good to be organizing in a bubble. An overemphasis on local production can lead to cooperative capitalism. Um, it's capitalism's a global system, right? And it can't be explicitly, it can't be sufficiently addressed solely at a local level, right? You're still going to have to engage in the broader capitalist, economy and global marketplace. So even if you do have a more egalitarian local approach, it's going to be interconnected in a whole bunch of ways, at least in the foreseeable short term, right? Um, with larger global capitalism, and this has been something that a critique that's been um, levied against large socialist projects throughout history, right? I mean, as early as the 20s, almost immediately after the Russian Revolution, the people like Gramsci were critiquing it, and saying, this is state run, but but still within the capitalist system. They didn't break free. Mao openly talked about it, right? Openly admitted it in his writings. And it can lead to reasons for real critique, right? Like looking at a project like Venezuela that's done many great things, in terms of housing and poverty and all these things, but it's a petro economy, right? It's based solely, their economy is heavily, heavily, heavily dependent on oil production. So it's an unecological system, even though it is more egalitarian, right? And because we're not able to address these fundamentals of capitalism at that local level alone, it can, as we become more localist and more isolated, our effectiveness in actually achieving broad change is going to be limited. So we've got to watch for that when we're doing decentralized organizing, and we need to make sure that we have inclusiveness in decision making at the grassroots level, right? It's one thing we'll definitely probably get into more later, but decentralization doesn't mean we can't have centralized planning and centralized funding. It means that we need to have decentralized democracy and democratic decision making and control at the local level. No state in this country has the funding presently to be able to adequately provide a real Medicare for all solution for everybody, right? It's just the federal level is the only place where that level of funding can easily be attained. So when we say we want Medicare for all, that's obviously a centralized system, but we need to make sure that it's community controlled through community health boards, and that local communities are controlling their budget, are controlling where their resources are allocated, and things like that. So having that inclusiveness in community decision making is essential to effective decentralized society. And then decentralization doesn't necessarily mean there's no hierarchy. The feudal era in Europe was highly decentralized with royalty. Joe Freeman's The Tyranny of Structurelessness is a great piece that every community organizer or political organizer should read, especially those that are operating within organizations that claim to want to successfully organize in a decentralized way. You should read it, and Joe Freeman's piece, because it really has some great points on like it says in there, the informal hierarchies, the way that lax bylaws are used by people who can leverage the way things are done, right? Decentralization doesn't mean there's no hierarchy, or no rules or anything like that. It's not chaos. Actually takes a high level of precision and efficiency. Garrett?
Yeah, I agree. The decentralization, you kind of have to look back a little bit toward history, and that's kind of what Joe Freeman was talking about in the essay here, that as kind of a response both to capitalism, but also this very statist version of socialism that you would see, back in the 60s and things. They were very centralized and very controlling, and tended to kind of tell members, you had to act certain ways or do certain things or whatever. And so there was this kind of anti-authoritarian backlash where a lot of groups at that time period wanted to, had good goals and good motives to try to avoid any sort of authoritarian structure, but then they kind of got lost in this decentralization thing where they were so afraid of being authoritarian that they didn't want to make any sort of formal rules or formal structure or anything like that. And the problem with that was that actually created its own version of authoritarian sort of structures. They just were hidden. They just were kind of behind the scenes in closed rooms and that sort of thing. They were these more informal hierarchies between people that knew each other and could, behind the scenes talk to each other and make decisions and things, because there was no formal process. There was no formal way that members could hold that structure accountable. So instead, it happened behind the scenes. So that's one thing that can unfortunately go wrong with decentralization if we're not careful. So we want to kind of really point out this thing here, that decentralization doesn't mean a lack of rules or a lack of accountability to the broader movement. In fact, it has to be more accountable, if anything, for it to work properly. And when it's working properly, it's very good. But you have to make sure that it works properly, and you have to balance that with criticisms that you see from other folks who will argue for a more centralized version of a socialist party or something like that by saying, if you're too off on your own and you get stuck in this very localism thing, it's a legit point that you can become very siloed, and instead of working with others, you become afraid of others or very isolated from yourself or from others, right? So what we're trying to do is find this balance here, that we don't want to become too centralized, of course, but if there's no rules at all, if it's kind of free for all, I don't want to tell you what to do, then that breaks down and kind of creates its own informal hierarchies. So when we're talking decentralization, we're trying to find that nice sweet spot there where folks have lots of autonomy to do things, and the decision making happens at local levels, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a certain amount of kind of administrative connection between everything, communications and accountability and things like that.
Yeah, and another big area that I realized isn't on here is that without clear processes, right, without democratically decided, conflict resolution, things like that, how a meeting's ran, right, when it descends into chaos, right, when there's no rules, it leaves it wide open for abuse by bad actors, right, because it means that there's no way to, interpersonal conflict can literally tear the entire organization apart. It's happened so many times, where you would think that organizations wouldn't be that susceptible, but when there's no clear path to, resolve issues, then they can often burn out of control. When there is, a clear bad actor, there's often no, there's often no way to actually address them, right? To remove them from the group, to engage in disciplinary action. And often when disciplinary action is taken in decentralized groups, there's a backlash against it because it's seen as, authoritarianism for even justified, disciplinary action on members or anything like that. So, and that goes to society too, right? When I look at our society, when I look at, an example I think of is local music cultures. I don't think I've ever encountered a local music culture that didn't have a problem with predatory behavior, where there wasn't a problem with people in bands dating way younger and underage people, that there wasn't a problem with, the cool kids getting away with stuff. It's every music culture I've encountered has had a level of this, right? And when we look at our society, we don't have means for conflict resolution, right? We have a justice system that is ineffective in a lot of the things I just talked about, but also it isn't designed for restorative justice. It's not designed for addressing issues. It's designed to punish, right? Or probably more accurately, it's designed to create revenue. In our modern, justice system.
It's also set up to be very adversarial as opposed to working together to actually solve the issue.
Yeah. So when we, even outside of talking about the Green Party, like in our local neighborhoods, in our local communities, we have a complete lack of processes and institutions and outlets to engage in restorative justice, to engage in conflict resolution. Our society doesn't provide them, and most of our institutions don't. Our civic institutions and political institutions don't provide them adequately either. So, without those things, it's very hard to, rein in problems and things like that. Whereas, I've been part of centralized organizations where, whole chapters could be thrown out on the whim of individuals in charge, right? So, like Garrett said, it's a balancing act. But I do think, one bullet point that we should have put on here was that how much it opens up for bad actors if you don't have these processes, and how that can completely derail all the work that's being done.